There is a figure that follows every human being, silent yet relentless. You cannot outrun it, nor can you silence it, for it walks where you walk, breathes where you breathe. Carl Jung called it the shadow, the hidden self, made of all that was once cast aside. Not merely hatred or rage, but desires too bold, dreams too dangerous, instincts too raw for the daylight of approval. Society teaches you to smile, to obey, to appear whole, while beneath the surface another truth gathers weight. What is denied does not die. It waits, and when it rises, it does so in ways you least expect, in sudden anger, in quiet sabotage, in the faces of others you claim to despise. To face the shadow is perilous. To ignore it is fatal. And so we begin with the first question: what the shadow really is. In every soul, there exists a hidden chamber where the unwanted is kept. Carl Jung named this chamber the shadow, not as a metaphor for evil, but as a description of all that the conscious mind refuses to carry in the light. It is not merely cruelty, rage, or envy that hide there, but often the very impulses that give vitality. Ambition muted by a fear of arrogance, independence buried beneath the need to please, tenderness silenced in a world that rewards hardness. The process begins early. A child who shouts with defiance may be chastised until their assertiveness decays into passivity. Another, brimming with wild imagination, may be told to be realistic, and so their creativity sinks into the depths. These disowned fragments, denied expression in the outer world, do not disappear. They collect in the unconscious, forming a second self, a hidden twin that moves silently beneath every decision. Modern psychology echoes Jung's intuition. Studies on repression show that emotions forced out of awareness intensify physiological stress. The body, through the heightened activity of the sympathetic nervous system, carries what the mind denies. Elevated cortisol levels and chronic activation of the amygdala have been observed in individuals who habitually suppress their anger or sadness. What is pushed down does not vanish. It becomes tension, anxiety, and unease that surface without apparent cause. And yet the shadow is not an intruder to be expelled. It is part of the psyche's wholeness, containing both the wound and the medicine. Within the same darkness where anger festers may also lie dormant courage. In the same forgotten recess where shame hides may be the seed of humility or empathy. To confront the shadow, then, is not to declare war on some monstrous entity, but to recognize that the neglected self, both its raw power and its fragility, waits patiently to be seen. But most refuse. To acknowledge the shadow is to admit that the polished mask of identity is incomplete. And so denial becomes habit, repression becomes second nature, and the unconscious grows heavy with unspoken truths. Yet denial carries a price. What is unacknowledged does not rest. It seeks expression, and when it cannot speak directly, it speaks in distortion. In sudden outbursts, in patterns repeated, in judgments projected onto others. This is the hidden danger of forgetting what lies within. For when the shadow is ignored, it does not disappear. It begins to act. And here we arrive at the next step of the journey, the cost of ignoring it. If this content is resonating with you, consider subscribing. I make videos that help you see the world and yourself more clearly. Thank you. The shadow, left unacknowledged, does not fade into silence. Instead, it learns the art of disguise. What the conscious mind refuses to carry openly, the unconscious mind releases in covert forms. Jung warned that what is repressed is never destroyed. It waits, watching for cracks in the surface, and when the mask of composure weakens, it steps forward to act in our place. This often reveals itself through projection. One may feel an almost irrational hatred toward arrogance, yet beneath the surface lies a buried hunger for recognition that has been long denied. Another may condemn weakness in others, not realizing that the condemnation is merely the echo of their own vulnerability, hidden away and unacknowledged. In this way, the shadow walks into the world wearing borrowed faces. Modern psychology provides a mirror to this insight. Studies on projection confirm that individuals who most vehemently criticize certain traits in others often harbor those very qualities within themselves. Neuroimaging has shown how unprocessed emotions stimulate hyperactivity in the amygdala, the brain's center of threat detection, causing even minor provocations to feel like overwhelming assaults. The nervous system, primed by what has been suppressed, cannot tell the difference between an external danger and an internal wound. The shadow also takes shape in patterns of repetition. Relationships collapse for the same reasons, careers falter at the same threshold, anger erupts in familiar situations. These cycles appear as fate, when in truth they are the unconscious insisting on recognition. Neuroscience describes this as the brain's reliance on established neural pathways. What is unresolved becomes the path most traveled until awareness interrupts the cycle. Without such interruption, the past repeats itself endlessly beneath the illusion of choice. Even health is not spared. Chronic suppression of emotion has been linked to hypertension, weakened immune responses, and increased risk of depression. The psyche that refuses to face itself finds ways to speak through the body, turning silence into symptom. What is ignored on the level of consciousness is written into flesh and blood. To ignore the shadow, then, is to surrender autonomy. One may believe they are steering their life, yet the hand on the wheel belongs to what is unacknowledged. This is why Jung's warning still resounds. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. And so arises the next question, a more practical one. How can the shadow, elusive and concealed, be recognized at all? This leads us into the next step of the journey. How to recognize your shadow. The shadow does not arrive as a stranger at the door. It is already seated within, quietly shaping the contours of thought and reaction. Yet it leaves traces, subtle signatures in daily life. Jung suggested that one of the surest paths to discovering it lies in what stirs disproportionate emotion. Irritation, disgust, and indignation often speak less of the world outside and more of what remains unacknowledged within. The figure despised in another may be nothing more than the reflection of a trait long banished to the unconscious. Consider how anger flares when encountering arrogance. Beneath the reaction may lie a buried yearning for recognition, denied so completely that it now appears intolerable when seen in others. Or think of the disdain that weakness provokes. It may, in truth, reveal a hidden fear of one's own fragility. In this sense, the shadow reveals itself not in light, but in the mirror of the other. Modern research on projection lends weight to this idea. Psychological studies have shown that individuals frequently assign to others the very characteristics they struggle to accept in themselves. Neurocognitive findings reveal how areas of the brain linked to self-referential processing activate strongly when judging others, suggesting that criticism may carry more about the critic's inner world than the subject of judgment. Thus, each irritation is less an accident and more a signal, a guidepost to the concealed. Dreams, too, provide a theater for the shadow's appearance. Recurring figures of shame, fear, or temptation often emerge as archetypal messengers. Neuroscience describes dreaming as the brain's attempt at emotional regulation, processing material that waking consciousness cannot bear. Jung saw in these nocturnal dramas a coded language of the unconscious, offering hints of what daylight refuses to admit. Even embarrassment carries meaning, The qualities that provoke shame or awkwardness frequently point toward energies that have been suppressed. A faltering voice when speaking boldly may reveal not weakness, but a hidden strength long exiled. The body, in its tremors and blushes, betrays what consciousness attempts to hide. Recognizing the shadow requires neither condemnation nor denial, but a willingness to see the concealed without judgment. For in those moments of recognition, the fragments of the self begin to stir, ready to be acknowledged. Yet recognition alone is not enough. To know the shadow exists is only the beginning. Unless what is seen is embraced, it will remain a disruptive force, breaking through in unconscious ways. This brings us to the final and most essential step: integrating the shadow before it controls you. To recognize the shadow is to glimpse the architecture of the hidden self, but to integrate it, that is the work of transformation. Jung was adamant that wholeness does not come from banishing the dark, but from weaving it into the fabric of consciousness. For what is disowned rules from the depths, yet what is accepted becomes strength. Integration does not mean indulgence. To acknowledge anger is not to erupt in rage, but to understand the energy it carries, the impulse toward protection, toward assertion, toward life itself. Neuroscience confirms that when emotions are named and processed, activity in the amygdala subsides, and the prefrontal cortex, the seat of reason, regains balance. To face the shadow, then, is to bring wild forces into dialogue with awareness, allowing instinct to serve rather than sabotage. The process often begins in solitude. Journaling uncensored thoughts and emotions can reveal patterns otherwise hidden in the rush of days. Dreams, when remembered and examined, carry symbols that repeat with stubborn persistence until their meaning is addressed. Creative expression, through painting, music, or movement, becomes another doorway, a way for the unconscious to speak in a language beyond words. Modern therapies echo this path, offering safe spaces where repressed material can surface and be met with compassion instead of judgment. The urgency of this work lies in its consequence. Shadows left unintegrated find expression in self-sabotage, the relationship that collapses again and again, the career halted at familiar thresholds, the sudden collapse of health under the weight of unspoken burdens. What is ignored eventually takes command. But when integrated, the very forces once feared become allies. Hidden rage becomes courage. Suppressed vulnerability becomes empathy. The fragments of the self gather into a fuller whole. Integration requires courage, for it asks the individual to surrender the illusion of purity and embrace the paradox of being both light and dark, noble and flawed. Yet in this paradox lies resilience. As Jung wrote, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And so the invitation is quiet but profound, to begin not with grand gestures, but with a single act of honesty toward the self. For in that honesty lies liberation. Now, a question lingers. If the shadow is not only what wounds, but also what waits to heal, what part of yourself calls most urgently for recognition? Share it below. Speak not for approval, but for clarity. And in doing so, perhaps the first step of integration has already begun.